A cold wind cut across the Colorado mountains in 1875, the kind that made folks stop talking and listen. That evening, the quiet road leading toward Ravenwood felt wrong in a way nobody could explain. A child's bicycle lay on its side near the edge of a shallow ravine, its front wheels slowly turning like it had been touched only moments before. No footprints, no sounds, no sign of life anywhere, just that lonely wheel spinning in the fading light, as if time itself had paused to ask what happened out here. Ravenwood was the kind of place where families trusted each other without question. People shared bread, shared tools, shared stories. But on that night, all of that trust cracked. A child had vanished and the town's voice went silent. Parents stood on their porches looking out into the darkness, wondering how danger managed to reach them without a warning. Something had happened on that road, something that left the whole community shaken before they even understood why. Some disappearances in old America weren't accidents. They were secrets people tried to bury in silence. And when a child vanished in Ravenwood, it wasn't treated like a mystery. It felt like a betrayal. It felt like a wound no one in that town had the courage to face. Before anyone understood what was happening, fear already had a grip on every parent. That's why this story strikes so hard, because it forces us to confront a question that never stops hurting. Have you ever had someone vanish without explanation? Someone you expected to walk through the door, and they never did? Ravenwood knew that feeling. The whole town carried it. One day, everything felt safe. The next, people realized safety had only been an illusion. The mountain roads they trusted, the neighbors they depended on, the routines they thought were harmless, all of it suddenly felt like a lie. Because the truth hit them with the force of a hammer. In 1875, Ravenwood believed nothing evil could survive in those mountains. They were wrong, dead wrong. And what came next didn't just break their sense of peace. It shattered every assumption they ever made about the people living beside them. What they discovered decades later rewrote everything they believed about their neighbors. So here's the truth that haunted Ravenwood for almost half a century. Why did an 11-year-old vanish in broad daylight on a road everyone used? This wasn't a child wandering off. This wasn't an accident. This was something far worse, a crime committed right under the community's nose. And yet no one saw anything. No one heard a cry. No one noticed a struggle. Ravenwood had to ask itself questions that burned like fire. How does a child disappear in a town where everyone knows everyone? What kind of person could take her and walk around for decades without anyone suspecting a thing? How did so many people miss the truth that was staring them in the face? These weren't just questions. They were accusations. The kind that made neighbors side-eye each other. The kind that turned every friendly smile into a potential mask. The kind that eroded trust for an entire generation. Because the real nightmare wasn't only the disappearance, it was this. Why did it take almost 50 years for someone, anyone, to be held accountable? Ravenwood wasn't just dealing with a missing child, it was dealing with the shame of realizing that the truth had been right there, hiding where no one bothered to look. Generations carried that anger. Families passed down the story not with sadness, but with a kind of bitterness that never softened. Because every year that passed without answers felt like another slap in the face. Another reminder that someone had gotten away with destroying a family and walking back into town like nothing happened. That's why this case isn't just history, it's a warning. A warning that people capable of harm don't always look dangerous. A warning that silence protects the wrong person. A warning that what happened to that little girl in 1875 has never stopped happening in towns just like yours. And that brings us to this moment. Your moment. Cases like this repeat today. Subscribe so danger never blindsides you. And if you ignore it, comment why you're risking that. Now that the shadow of this mystery is laid bare, we have to step into the part of the story that hurts the most. To understand how this tragedy struck, we must see the world of the child it stole, her routines, her innocence, her last ordinary moments before everything collapsed. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. For Ravenwood became a town marked by pain. It knew a little girl who brought light to almost every doorstep she passed. Her name was Marissa Delaney, just 11 years old, small in height, but full of a spark that made people turn and smile whenever she ran by. She had that rare kind of energy children carried in those days, the kind shaped by open fields and endless dirt roads, not by fear. She spent her mornings picking smooth stones from the creek bed, proudly stuffing them in her pockets until they sagged. She spent afternoons racing her bike down the hillside, laughing so hard she'd lose her breath before she hit the bottom. People in town knew her well, not because she stood out for trouble, but because she carried herself with a kind of gentle boldness. She approached everyone with respect, even adults who often kept to themselves. Shop owners remembered her knocking gently on their counters, asking about leftover scraps of ribbon for her stone collection. Neighbors often saw her sitting on the porch steps with her mother, brushing dust off her clothes after a long day of exploring. Marissa didn't know fear. She didn't know caution. She lived like the world was kind by default, a world where the biggest concern was getting home before the lamps were lit. She wore her striped sweater almost every day, even when it was warm, claiming it made her bike faster, and nobody ever bothered to argue. To the people of Ravenwood, she wasn't just a child. She was the small reminder that their town still had joy, still had hope, still had innocence left in it. Losing her meant losing a piece of themselves. Before going deeper into what happened, there's something you need to think about. Something that connects you directly to this story in a way most people never expect. Did you roam freely as a child? Did you ever grab your bike, run outside, and disappear into the day without anyone worrying? Maybe you only planned to visit a friend down the street. Maybe you followed a trail just to see where it led. Maybe you rode farther than you were allowed, trusting nothing bad would happen because nothing bad ever had. For many, childhood was built on trust, the kind that made you believe the world around you was safe simply because you hadn't seen the opposite yet. Do you remember the one place you always felt safe? The corner store, a friend's porch, the open field where the wind felt like freedom? Marissa had those places too. She had roads she knew by heart, neighbors she greeted without hesitation, and an entire community she believed would always look out for her. That's what makes her story so painful. She didn't take risks. She didn't wander off into danger. She didn't break rules. She simply lived the way every child should be able to live, freely, and that freedom cost her everything. October 14th, 1875 began like every other day for Marissa, simple, quiet, and filled with the kind of excitement only children understand. She woke up early, tugged on her striped sweater, and hurried through breakfast so she could get outside before the morning air lost its freshness. Her mother reminded her to be back before supper, and Marissa nodded with that confident smile she always gave when she knew exactly where she was going. She grabbed her red bicycle from the porch, the same one she had ridden for years, the same one people in town recognized instantly. She planned to visit her friend Cindy, who lived only 3 blocks away. It was a short ride on a road she'd taken hundreds of times. Nothing about that afternoon seemed unusual. Not to her parents, not to the neighbors who saw her pass, not to anyone. After spending time with her friend, she decided to stop by the small soda stand near the main road, a place she loved for its sweet drinks and friendly chatter. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't looking over her shoulder. She was simply living another ordinary day in a town she trusted. But that routine walk, that small stop, that familiar road, that was the moment everything shifted. She never reached the soda stand. She never made it home. And the road that once felt harmless suddenly became the line between innocence and tragedy. What happened in that stretch of time remains one of the most painful questions Ravenwood ever had to face. To understand the weight of this tragedy, you have to see the world through the eyes of Marissa's parents, Eleanor and Victor Delaney. They weren't wealthy. They weren't influential. They were a simple frontier family who believed in routine, honesty, and the comfort of knowing their daughter could walk through town without fear. Eleanor was the heart of the household. She woke before sunrise every day, lit the stove, and hummed softly while preparing breakfast. She always made sure Marissa's sweater was clean, her pockets were empty of stones, and her shoes were tied tight enough to keep her steady on her bike. She wasn't controlling, just caring. She believed the world would treat her daughter with the same kindness she tried to show others. Victor was quieter, but his love was no less powerful. He worked long days, often coming home with dust on his clothes and exhaustion in his posture. But no matter how tired he was, he always asked Marissa about her day. He expected her to grow up in a town where people looked out for each other, where neighbors could be trusted, where children could run free without danger waiting around the corner. To them, Ravenwood wasn't just a community, Quentin. It was a shield, a place where harm wasn't supposed to reach their little girl, a place where a child's laughter belonged, not fear. So when Marissa didn't come home that evening, it wasn't confusion they felt first. It was shock. A kind of shock that shakes your belief in everything you thought was safe. Supper time in the Delaney home was usually steady and predictable. Eleanor set the table. Victor washed up after a long day. The lamp glowed softly in the corner. It was the kind of routine that held their family together. But on that evening, one chair stayed empty. At first, Eleanor told herself Marissa must have lost track of time. Children did that, especially her, always caught up in something harmless, always eager to squeeze a few more minutes out of her day. But as the sky dimmed and the mountain air grew colder, Eleanor began pacing the front porch, her eyes locked on the road. Victor tried to stay calm, telling himself their daughter would pedal around the corner any second. But he checked the clock again and again. Each minute felt heavier than the last. When the meal cooled untouched on the table, he felt something tighten in his chest, something he tried to ignore. By the time the clock struck 8, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a question neither of them wanted to face. Eleanor called the Peterson household, hoping to hear Cindy's voice say they were still playing, still laughing, still fine. But the words she heard instead hit her like a blow. Marissa left hours ago. That's when the panic finally snapped free. Victor grabbed his coat. Eleanor ran outside without one. Every thought they had was the same. Find her. Find her now, before the night takes her. They didn't know it yet, but those first frantic steps were the beginning of a nightmare they would carry for decades. The moment the Delaneys realized Marissa wasn't just late, she was missing. The quiet of Ravenwood shattered. Victor rushed toward the road she usually took, calling her name until his voice grew raw. Eleanor followed close behind, tears already streaking down her face, clutching her apron like it could somehow steady her shaking hands. Neighbors stepped outside when they heard the shouting. At first, most assumed it was a misunderstanding. Maybe Marissa was with another friend, maybe she'd taken the long way home. But the fear in Eleanor's voice stripped away any doubt. Within minutes, lanterns were lit, wagons pulled out, dogs brought forward, and people who barely spoke to each other on a normal day were now walking shoulder to shoulder into the dark. The sheriff arrived, but he wasn't prepared for anything like this. He brought no real plan, no real direction, just a lantern and a hope that the child would answer soon. The search lines were disorganized, voices overlapping as they tried to cover the same areas again and again. Every rustle of leaves made someone turn. Every snap of a twig felt like a clue, but nothing came of it. Hours passed, and the cold crept in. Some volunteers suggested she might be hiding or too scared to come out. Others whispered far worse possibilities that Eleanor refused to acknowledge. Victor searched the same stretch of road repeatedly, convinced he must have missed something. Then just after sunrise, a shout echoed across the ravine. Marissa's bicycle had been found, lying on its side in a shallow ditch. No child nearby, no tracks leading away, no signs of where she could have gone. The front wheel spun slowly, like it had been touched only moments before. But Marissa was nowhere. The search party gathered around the ravine in stunned silence. No one spoke at first, they couldn't. The sight of that small red bicycle lying on its side struck every adult there with the same painful truth. Something terrible had happened, and it had happened fast. Victor crouched beside the bike, his hands trembling as he reached for the handlebars. Eleanor couldn't bring herself to step any closer. Her knees buckled, and someone behind her caught her before she fell. The early morning wind brushed past them, cold and sharp, carrying a chill that felt too intentional to ignore. One of the volunteers pointed with a shaking hand. The wheel was still turning, slow, uneven, almost like the air itself hadn't realized she was gone yet. Every person standing there understood what that meant. Whatever happened to Marissa had happened moments before they arrived. They weren't hours behind. They were seconds behind. And whoever took her had vanished into the quiet, leaving nothing but that spinning wheel as a warning that the nightmare was only beginning. In the hours before everything went wrong, Marissa had been doing something simple, something gentle, something that reflected the kind of heart she had. As she rode her bike down the familiar road, she spotted a small bird near the ditch, struggling to flap one of its wings. It wasn't moving much, just twitching, like it couldn't decide whether to fight or surrender. Without hesitation, she stopped her bike and slid off the seat. Most children might have ignored it, too focused on getting home or reaching their next destination. But not Marissa. She knelt beside the tiny creature, brushing dirt away from its feathers, whispering encouragement like she believed her voice alone could keep it alive. That pause, innocent, harmless, kind, placed her at the exact spot where a set of eyes were watching. She didn't know she wasn't alone. She didn't know someone had slowed their wagon a few yards behind her. She didn't know that while she focused on helping something weaker than herself, someone stronger and far more dangerous had focused on her. The road was empty, no other riders, no farmers returning from the fields, no neighbors passing by on foot. The trees' muffled sound and the fading daylight hid everything except the small circle of space she occupied. This was the moment her kindness became a weakness, a moment when her good intentions created the opening a predator had been waiting for. She lifted the bird gently, trying to stand it upright. It fell over again, and she let out a soft siboing, the kind of sigh only an 11-year-old could make, full of concern and innocence. She never heard the footsteps behind her. She never sensed the presence closing in. She never realized that pausing for a helpless creature had placed her directly in harm's path. In the span of a single breath, her private act of compassion became the last peaceful moment she would ever know. Marissa was still kneeling beside the injured bird when the world around her shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet way that should have warned her, yet didn't. The wind dropped. The trees stopped rustling. Even the usual hum of distant activity faded into nothing. It was the kind of stillness that should have made anyone uneasy, but she was too focused on the tiny creature trembling in her hands to sense the danger creeping toward her. Her bicycle rested a few feet away, one pedal angled toward the sky like it was frozen mid-motion. The road stretched behind her, empty and silent. Dust settled from the last passerby hours ago. Out in the open, she looked almost fragile. A small child on a wild, lonely trail with no protection except the confidence she had in her surroundings. A soft crunch sounded behind her, a shoe pressing into dry earth. She turned her head slightly, not enough to see who was there, just enough for a flicker of confusion to cross her face. Confusion that didn't have the chance to grow into fear. A hand clamped over her mouth. Another arm swept around her waist, lifting her off the ground before her lungs could even gather enough air to scream. The bird slipped from her hands. Her feet kicked in the empty space, brushing against nothing but cold air as she struggled to break free. The attacker didn't speak. He didn't grunt. He didn't make a sound. His movements were quick, practiced, almost familiar with the layout of that road. He dragged her away from the trail, down a narrow path hidden between thick brush, the kind no child ever had reason to explore. Marissa clawed at his arm. She twisted, hoping to loosen his grip, but he never loosened, not once. Dust rose beneath their feet as she was carried away from the life she knew, away from the bike she loved, away from the town that trusted too easily, away from the helpless bird she had tried so hard to save. By the time the road returned to silence, it was as if she had been swallowed by the land itself, taken without noise, without witness, without a trace the town would understand for nearly 5 decades. When news of Marissa's disappearance spread, Ravenwood reacted in the only way a small frontier town knew how, by talking. Not softly, not kindly, but with the kind of desperate whispers that reveal more fear than facts. People needed someone to blame, someone to point at, someone to watch with narrowing eyes as they walked down the street. The first name that circulated through the town was Theodore Teddy Vance. Teddy ran the bait shop near the ravine. He was quiet, kept mostly to himself, and spoke only when necessary. He had a face that rarely smiled and a habit of lingering outside his shop after dark. To some, that made him mysterious. To others, it made him dangerous. He had been seen on the same road earlier that week, pushing a cart of supplies toward the creek. In a town burning with panic, that small detail was enough to make him the first target of suspicion. Then there was Kenneth Olson, a young man known for bad decisions and occasional trouble with the law. He drifted from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to prove he could be trusted. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't dependable either. People remembered him getting into fights behind the saloon and leaving town for days without explanation. When the sheriff questioned him, Kenneth claimed he was at home repairing tools that evening. Alone. No witnesses, no alibi. And whispers grew from there. Neighbors leaned closer on porches, lowering their voices as children were rushed indoors. Women in the general store exchanged uneasy glances when certain men entered. Men at the mill stopped working mid-shift to share theories about who could have taken a child so quickly, so cleanly, without leaving a sign. The fear didn't bring the town together. It split them. Every suspicious glance became a warning. Every odd behavior became evidence. Every distant personality became a threat. Some insisted Teddy was guilty simply because he preferred solitude. Others pointed at Kenneth's rough past and claimed his temper made him capable of anything. A few even whispered names of men who had never been in trouble, because that's how desperate people become when they're terrified. But the truth was far worse. The real culprit wasn't either of them. He wasn't even on their list. And every hour they spent blaming the wrong man pulled them further away from the truth, a truth that would come back to hit Ravenwood harder than anyone could imagine. Sheriff Dale Hansen wasn't a cruel man. He wasn't careless on purpose, but he was completely overwhelmed. And that failure became one of the most painful scars in Ravenwood's history. When he reached the ravine, lantern in hand, he stared at Marissa's abandoned bicycle, as though he expected the scene to speak to him. He waited for answers that weren't there. He waited for clues he didn't know how to look for. The sheriff had dealt with missing livestock, drunken fights, land disputes, not the sudden disappearance of a child. And that lack of experience cost the Delaney family far more than they ever imagined. He didn't search the brush properly. He didn't mark the area before footprints were trampled by volunteers. He didn't record statements clearly. He didn't collect fibers from the bicycle or examine the scuffs on the ground. Everything was rushed, messy, disorganized. While parents cried and neighbors shouted theories into the cold air, Sheriff Hansen was flipping through a notebook that barely contained anything useful. He scribbled short, vague notes that would later lead nowhere. He allowed people to crowd the scene, destroying traces that might have pointed straight to the abductor. And every misguided decision he made became another nail in the coffin of this investigation. People began noticing cracks in his leadership. He told the Delaneys he was doing everything possible, but deep down he knew he wasn't equipped for something like this. He didn't request outside help. He didn't expand the search far enough. He didn't question certain individuals with enough pressure. He just hoped the problem would solve itself, that maybe Marissa would walk out of the woods crying, but unharmed. That never happened. Years later, long after he retired, people would say he aged faster than other men. They said he carried the weight of this failure everywhere he went. And they were right, because he knew better than anyone that the clues were there, and he missed them. He missed the subtle signs. He missed the chance to confront the right man. He missed the opportunity to end the nightmare before it dragged on for decades. His mistakes didn't simply delay justice. They buried it. As the days passed with no sign of Marissa, Ravenwood changed, not slowly, instantly. The kind of shift that tears through a community like a cold blade. People who once waved at each other from their porches now kept their doors locked and their curtains drawn. Mothers refused to let their children wander outside. Fathers escorted their sons to the well and back, gripping their shoulders as if danger lurked in every shadow. Stores that once buzzed with chatter fell quiet. Shopkeepers stood behind their counters, watching every unfamiliar face that walked in, their eyes sharp and tense. Travelers passing through Ravenwood were met not with warm hospitality, but with suspicion. Folks questioned everything: the way someone walked, the tone of their voice, how long they lingered at the edge of town. Even simple acts, like a stranger asking for directions, became reasons to step back. Children who once filled the streets with laughter now walked in groups, clinging to each other. Adults insisted on escorting them everywhere, even to places only a short distance from home. Teachers kept classroom doors closed and windows latched during lessons. Churches began evening prayers earlier, telling families to return home before the sky darkened. Rumors didn't just spread, they multiplied. Some swore they saw a wagon they didn't recognize. Others claimed they heard footsteps late at night. A few insisted the kidnapper was someone they'd known for years. And with each theory, distrust grew deeper, carving lines between neighbors who had once shared meals and raised barns together. Ravenwood stopped feeling like a community. It felt like a trap, one where the enemy wasn't outside the town, but possibly living within it. Families started sleeping with lamps burning through the night. Parents sat on porches holding rifles across their laps. No one walked alone, not even for a moment. The calm mountain town that once promised safety became a place where every sound set hearts racing, where every person looked over their shoulder, where fear controlled every decision. And all the while, the real culprit watched the world panic around him. As fear tightened its grip on Ravenwood, everyone believed they were doing the right thing. They searched the woods. They questioned neighbors. They pointed fingers at the most obvious suspects. They clung to any hint of an answer, hoping it would lead them closer to the truth. But in that frantic desperation, everyone overlooked the one detail that mattered most. Not because they were careless, but because they couldn't bring themselves to question the people they trusted most. The sheriff focused on the wrong men. Neighbors whispered about the strange ones, the drifters, the loners. Families blamed outsiders. People convinced themselves the danger had to come from far away, because believing it came from someone they knew was too painful to accept. Ravenwood was so determined to look outward that they never stopped to look inward, and that mistake would cast a shadow over the town for nearly 50 years. Because while everyone was scanning the roads and forest lines for a monster, the real threat walked past them every day. He nodded politely. He attended community gatherings. He helped organize charity events. He lived among them, unnoticed, untouched, unchallenged, all the while carrying the weight of a crime that should have been uncovered within days. What everyone missed became the very thing that would return decades later with the force of a storm, reopening wounds the town tried to forget. And when the truth finally surfaced, Ravenwood would learn a brutal lesson. Sometimes the person you least suspect is the one you should have feared the most. What they didn't realize then was this: the clues were already in front of them, waiting, but no one had the courage to connect them. What everyone missed would come back to haunt them 50 years later. By this point in the story, one thing becomes painfully clear. Ravenwood didn't just lose a child, it lost its ability to trust the very ground it stood on. The wrong people were accused. The right man walked freely, and every hour that passed made the truth harder to see. This is the kind of case that forces you to look at your own surroundings, your street, your neighborhood, your daily routine. Because if an entire town could miss danger standing right beside them, then anyone can. That's why this moment matters, not just for Marissa, but for you watching right now. If you want the truth before danger finds you, subscribe right now, not tomorrow, not later. Now, while the warning is still in front of you. And if you hear this and still refuse to subscribe, then do something for me. If you still won't, comment why you're choosing silence. Your reason matters because staying quiet in moments like this has consequences. Consequences. Ravenwood learned the hardest way possible. What comes next in this story isn't a relief. It's the moment when decades of mistakes collide with a truth no one in town was prepared to face. 23 years after Marissa vanished, Ravenwood learned how grief never truly settles. It only hides until something forces it back to the surface. That something arrived in the spring of 1998 when the mountains released more snowmelt than anyone had seen in decades. Streams overflowed, roads washed out. Willow Creek, normally a quiet ribbon of water, roared with enough force to tear away the soil that had held firm for generations. For most people, the flood was just another hardship. Damaged fences, ruined tool sheds, rushing water carrying fallen branches downstream. But deep inside the forest, far from the main road, the torrent carved into the bank with relentless strength, stripping away layers of earth until something unnatural was exposed, something that didn't belong in the wild. Two hikers, Eliza and Finian O'Connell, were following the trail when they saw a patch of fabric sticking out from the collapsed embankment. At first, they thought it was debris left behind by the flooding. But when Finian pulled it free, the ground shifted. A piece of a tarp slid forward, then another. He froze. Eliza stepped back. Neither of them spoke, because both realized at the same moment that this wasn't trash. It was a burial. Wrapped inside the torn, mud-covered tarp was a small, partially preserved body, too small to be an adult, too fragile to belong to anyone who had died recently. Eliza screamed, a sound that echoed through the trees with a sharpness that didn't fade even when help arrived. The sheriff's office secured the area. The remains were carried out carefully, with a level of seriousness that had been missing decades earlier. And while no one said it out loud, everyone felt the same sinking certainty. After all these years, after all the pain, after all the unanswered questions, Marissa Delaney had finally been found. And the truth she carried with her was about to rip open every old wound Ravenwood thought time had buried. The sheriff's office transported the remains to the coroner's building with a level of care that Ravenwood had not shown all those years ago. Word spread across town within hours, traveling faster than any wagon could move. By nightfall, people gathered outside their homes, whispering to each other with trembling voices, already fearing what the officials were going to confirm. Inside the examination room, the coroner began the heartbreaking process of identifying the small body. The tarp wrapped around the remains was old and weathered, its fabric stiff from years underground. But one thing stood out. The tear pattern matched the cut marks recorded in the original case file from 1975, a detail overlooked, forgotten, or ignored, now impossible to deny. Dental records were the next step. The sheriff at the time of the discovery, far more meticulous than Hansen had ever been, dug through storage boxes until he found the old file. Inside, folded carefully, were the records from Marissa's last dental appointment. The match was immediate and absolute. The moment the coroner confirmed it, the room fell silent in a way that felt heavy and suffocating. There was no celebration, no sense of relief, only the crushing reality that Ravenwood had failed to protect an innocent child, failed to find her in time, failed to uncover the truth for decades. But the worst part wasn't the identification. It was the cause of death. The coroner's report revealed marks on the skull, clear, unmistakable signs of blunt force trauma. Not an accident, not a fall, but a violent strike strong enough to end a life instantly. News of this detail spread through Ravenwood like a shockwave. The discovery didn't just reopen old grief, it reignited anger that had been simmering beneath the town's surface for years. Parents who had raised their children in fear now understood that their terror had been justified all along. People who once dismissed the Delaney's desperation now felt the sting of guilt. The tarp, the grave, the cruel blow that ended Marissa's life. Everything pointed to one irrefutable truth. Someone in Ravenwood had been living freely while a child's body lay hidden in the earth for nearly 23 years. And the town was about to learn just how close that person had been all along. The discovery of Marissa's body should have brought answers, but instead it deepened the town's agony. The tarp, the injury, the location, all pointed to a killer who had moved carefully and confidently. Yet no one in the sheriff's department had anything solid to hold on to. For years, the case remained open, but not active. Evidence was boxed, stored, and slowly forgotten. Officers retired, residents passed away. Ravenwood tried to move on, even though the wound never truly healed. Then, in the early 2000s, something unexpected happened. Colorado launched a new initiative aimed at solving old crimes using forensic methods that hadn't existed in the 1970s. Cold case files were pulled out, re-examined, and taken to modern labs equipped with tools Sheriff Hansen could never have imagined. Among those files was the packet labeled Marissa Delaney. Inside it, sealed in a small envelope, was a tiny fiber sample collected from the remnants of her clothing, evidence far too degraded for earlier technology to process. But now things had changed. A forensic team extracted what little material remained from the fiber. They pushed the machines to their limits, amplifying the sample again and again until a partial DNA profile emerged. It was faint, incomplete, fragile, but it was there. The first step was to run it through CODIS, the national database used to identify offenders. The result? No match, not even a close relative. For most investigators, that would have been the end, but not for Sergeant Alistair Novak, a determined investigator who had spent years studying cases where traditional methods failed. Novak believed technology could uncover what human error had buried. He authorized the use of genealogical mapping, a new approach that compared the unknown DNA against public ancestry databases. It wasn't simple, it wasn't quick. It required thousands of connections, family trees, and cross-checks. And then, finally, something surfaced, a distant genetic link. A branch with a name Ravenwood recognized, a thread leading directly to the Olsen family, the same family tied to one of the early suspects nearly 5 decades earlier. But the match wasn't Kenneth Olsen. It pointed somewhere else, another relative, someone who had never once appeared on the sheriff's lists, someone respected, someone trusted. And as the genealogy chart grew clearer, Sergeant Novak felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The trail didn't lead to an outsider. It led to a man whose connections reached deep into Ravenwood's history, a man whose name carried weight in every corner of the town. Ed Thorne. The genealogical results shook the investigation in a way no one expected. When the Olsen name first appeared in the branching chart, it felt almost like a cruel joke, a circle leading back to the same family Sheriff Hansen had fixated on decades earlier. But this time, the science wasn't vague, and the leads weren't based on rumor or town gossip. The DNA connection was real. Still, something didn't add up. The profile didn't match Kenneth Olsen, the man the town had once whispered about with suspicion. Kenneth had been interrogated, monitored, and quietly judged for years after Marissa disappeared. But the DNA testing ruled him out with complete certainty. His bloodline held the connection, but he didn't. Sergeant Novak dug deeper, expanding the genealogical branches outward. Distant cousins, siblings, family marriages. Each connection added another piece to the expanding network. And slowly, the data carved a path leading away from Kenneth and towards someone else entirely. Someone no one suspected. Someone who appeared in old photos standing beside the Delaney family at charity events. Someone who donated lumber to rebuild homes after storms. Someone who volunteered during town gatherings, always smiling, always helpful, always present. His name sat at the intersection of the genetic markers, highlighted by multiple cross-links in the genealogical mapping. The more Novak cross-referenced, the clearer it became. Ed Thorne's genetics aligned with the unknown DNA found on Marissa's clothing. When the team reviewed older files, they realized something devastating. Ed had never been questioned, never interviewed, never even considered. Not because he had an alibi, but because everyone trusted him. He owned the Ravenwood lumber mill, employing dozens of townspeople. He served on community boards. He contributed to local events. He shook hands with the sheriff. He comforted families during hard times. He even supported Marissa's mother, Eleanor, through the early years after her daughter vanished. This wasn't just oversight. It was a blind spot, the kind that forms when a community believes danger only comes from the shadows, never from the man standing in the daylight, offering help with a warm smile. Sergeant Novak took one long breath before making the call. The evidence was clear. The DNA didn't lie. The trail led straight to a man Ravenwood admired for nearly half a century, the very man who hid the truth in plain view. When Sergeant Novak laid out the completed genealogical chart on his desk, the room fell quiet. Every line, every dotted branch, every distant match all funneled toward one undeniable conclusion. The pattern didn't waver. The names didn't conflict. The science didn't bend. It all pointed to Ed Thorne, not Kenneth Olsen, not Teddy Vance, not any of the townspeople the sheriff had once hounded with desperation and guesswork. It pointed to the man who donated lumber for school repairs, the man who delivered firewood to families during harsh winters, the man who stood beside grieving parents in photos, offering comfort with steady hands and a calm expression. The man no one ever questioned, because questioning him felt unthinkable. Novak stared at the chart and felt the full weight of what it meant. Ravenwood hadn't just overlooked the truth, it had embraced the very person responsible for the tragedy. For decades, the town's trust had shielded a man who should have been confronted from the very beginning. The investigators reviewed every branch again, searching for errors, hoping for a mistake. But the evidence only grew stronger. The connection between the unknown DNA and Ed Thorne's bloodline was undeniable. And as the last page of the analysis settled on the table, so did the truth the town had avoided for nearly 50 years. A man beloved by the town sat at the center of the family tree. A man they praised, a man they relied on, a man who had fooled an entire community for almost half a century. This was the moment the story shifted from tragedy to reckoning. The moment the warrant was signed, the investigation shifted from quiet suspicion to explosive urgency. Officers didn't stroll onto Ed Thorne's property. They marched. For decades, people had walked his land freely, asking for lumber, returning borrowed tools, sitting on his porch during summer storms. But today, every step felt like trespassing into the heart of a lie no one wanted to believe existed. The first stop was the old shed behind his house. Locals knew it well, or thought they did. Ed often told people it was where he stored outdated equipment or broken supplies that he planned to fix one day. The truth was far uglier. When officers forced the door open, the smell of rotting wood and stale oil washed over them. Dust filled the air. Tools hung neatly on the walls, each handled with the care of someone who lived his entire life around lumber. But the orderliness only made the next discovery more jarring. In the far corner, almost hidden beneath a stack of weathered boards, sat an axe handle. It was wrapped in a piece of old canvas that looked disturbingly familiar. The officers unwrapped it slowly, and what they saw made the air feel heavier, as if the entire room exhaled in grief. The handle was cracked, splintered along one edge, the exact shape that matched the blow recorded in Marissa's autopsy. The weight of it in their hands felt cruel, like holding the very object that ended her life. But that wasn't all. Up in the attic of the main house, officers found a wooden trunk covered in dust. Inside, folded tightly, was an aged car tarp, thick, faded, and torn in a pattern that matched the one pulled from the grave in 1998. It was the final confirmation. The tarp wasn't just similar. It wasn't just close. It was the same tarp used to hide Marissa's body for 23 years. The shed, the handle, the tarp, three pieces of evidence, all pointing to one horrifying conclusion. Ed Thorne hadn't been a helpful neighbor trying to comfort a grieving family. He had been hiding the truth, and he had been doing it while standing in the center of their trust. When investigators laid out the evidence, the axe handle, the tarp, the hiding places, one question rose above every other. Why would a man like Ed Thorne do this? People in Ravenwood had always described Ed as steady, dependable, almost painfully ordinary. He worked at the lumber mill from the time he was old enough to lift a hammer. He knew every tool, every machine, every stack of timber that came through the mill yard. His life looked predictable to the point of boredom. But beneath that plain surface, something far more dangerous had been simmering for years. Detectives pieced together a troubling picture. Ed didn't strike because of sudden madness or drunken rage. He didn't act out of jealousy or revenge. His crime wasn't planned in the traditional sense, but it wasn't an accident either. The evidence pointed to a mixture of impulse and control, a moment where opportunity collided with a man who had never learned how to handle his own anger. Working in the lumber mill had shaped him. The physical strain, the pressure to appear strong, the unspoken code of frontier masculinity, all of it carved a harsh edge into him. Men were expected to hold their emotions tight. They were taught to swallow frustration, bury weakness, and never show fear or hesitation. Ed lived by those rules so intensely that they became his cage. Witness accounts from the mill, collected years later, revealed a pattern. Ed never raised his voice in public, but his coworkers remembered flashes of aggression, a slammed tool, A board snapped in half when no one was watching, a tightening of the jaw when he was challenged. Small moments, quick moments, but enough to paint an early warning. On that October day in 1875, when Ed saw Marissa alone on the road, he faced a choice: turn away or act on the darker impulses he never confronted. He chose the latter. Some investigators believe he lashed out in a burst of anger triggered by something insignificant. Maybe a memory, maybe a frustration he carried from the mill, maybe his own inability to control the part of himself he never wanted anyone to see. Others suspect he had been waiting for a moment like this, not planning it, but ready to take advantage of a situation where no one would question him. What is certain is this: Ed wasn't driven by madness. He wasn't drawn in by opportunity alone. He acted because he believed he could get away with it. And for nearly 50 years, he did. The morning of the arrest began like any other in Ravenwood. Workers filed into the lumber mill. The steady rhythm of saws echoed across the yard. Ed Thorne moved through the workspace with his usual calm expression, nodding to employees, offering familiar greetings, completely unaware that his final moments of freedom were slipping away. At exactly 9:17 a.m., 3 patrol cars rolled up the dirt road leading to the mill. Engines off, doors opening in unison. A silence spread across the yard as workers turned to stare. Some stepped back. Others stood frozen with tools still in their hands. Sergeant Novak led the team. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward Ed, flanked by officers who knew the weight of what was about to happen. Ed looked confused at first, as if someone had called him over to ask about lumber shipments or equipment repairs. But when Novak read his name aloud, followed by the words, "Under arrest," Ed's expression shifted. Not shock, not anger. Something colder, something that made several workers step away from him. People began gathering along the edge of the mill yard: staff, townsfolk who heard the commotion, others passing by. Faces changed as the truth settled in. Confusion turned to disbelief. Disbelief twisted into horror. Men who had shared meals with Ed shook their heads violently, refusing to accept what they were seeing. Women held their hands over their mouths, whispering prayers and curses in the same breath. When the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound seemed impossibly loud, echoing against the wooden walls of the mill. For a town that once trusted this man with repairs, donations, and community projects, that sound was a violent reminder that everything they believed about him had been wrong. Ed didn't struggle. He didn't deny anything. He didn't ask what evidence they had. He simply stared ahead, jaw tight, as if he finally understood that the truth he buried in the ground had clawed its way back to the surface. And as he was escorted toward the patrol car, the crowd parted, not out of respect, but out of fear. People looked at him the way you look at a stranger who just stepped into your home uninvited. For decades, they admired him. Now they couldn't stand to be within arm's reach. In that single moment, Ravenwood realized that the monster they feared all those years wasn't hiding in the forest. He had been standing with them at every community event, smiling, nodding, helping, pretending. When Ed Thorne was driven away from the lumber mill in the back of the patrol car, Ravenwood didn't just lose a neighbor. It lost every sense of safety it had ever believed in. For decades, townsfolk had comforted themselves with the idea that Marissa's killer was some drifter, some stranger, someone who slipped into town and slipped back out before anyone noticed. But now the truth was staring them dead in the face. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a traveler. It wasn't someone passing through. It was him, the man who delivered fresh lumber to widows when storms tore through their roofs. The man who held doors open for mothers carrying groceries. The man who donated wood to build the new playground. The same playground children used to honor Marissa every spring. The man who offered condolences to Eleanor Delaney for nearly half a century, while knowing exactly where her daughter was buried. People felt sick. Some collapsed to their knees right there in the mill yard. Others cried openly, unable to hide their heartbreak. A few shouted his name with rage, demanding answers that would never heal what he had destroyed. The betrayal cut so deep that families struggled to breathe. Men who once admired Ed clenched their fists, trying to understand how they could have stood beside him for years. Women who had trusted him around their children covered their mouths, fighting the urge to scream. Teenagers who grew up helping him stack lumber stared in disbelief, realizing they had shaken hands with the person responsible for the darkest moment in their town's history. And then came the truth that broke Ravenwood completely. The man who stood beside grieving parents was the man they should have feared. Eleanor Delaney heard the news from her living room. When the someone finally said Ed's name aloud, she didn't speak. She didn't blink. Her entire body went still. A silence heavier than grief filled the room as she pressed a hand over her mouth, not to muffle a cry, but because her breath wouldn't come. Victor stood behind her, his fingers gripping the back of her chair until his knuckles turned white. He had spent years blaming strangers, roads, shadows. Never once did he imagine the danger had been shaking his hand at community events. Ravenwood wasn't just heartbroken, it was shattered. Everything they thought they knew about safety, trust, and neighborly goodness had collapsed in an instant. And the worst part? This wasn't even the final blow. The courthouse in Ravenwood had seen its share of disputes, land arguments, theft cases, minor assaults, but nothing had prepared it for the trial that now consumed the entire town. Crowds lined the steps each morning long before the doors opened. Reporters from across the state gathered, their notebooks ready, waiting to capture every breath, every tear, every tremor running through the community. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere pulsed with tension. Families who once shared meals now sat on opposite sides, refusing to acknowledge each other. Former co-workers of Ed Thorne avoided eye contact, ashamed of the years they had spent trusting him. Even the judge looked heavier, as though the weight of the case pressed against his chest. The prosecution began with the evidence. They laid the axe handle on the table, the one found in Ed's shed. The room went silent. Not a cough, not a chair scrape, nothing. Then came the tarp, folded, faded, torn in the same jagged pattern as the one recovered from the burial site. When the forensic expert confirmed the match, several people in the audience cried out. Others covered their faces, unable to look. Next came the scientific testimony, the DNA analysis that had linked the unknown profile to Ed Thorne's family line. The forensic specialist explained the fiber sample, the amplification process, the elimination of other relatives, and the unmistakable connection pointing to Ed himself. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as decades of doubt collapsed under the weight of modern science. Witness after witness took the stand. A former mill worker described Ed's eruptions of anger when he thought no one was watching. Another recalled seeing Ed's wagon near the area where Marissa disappeared, a detail they dismissed at the time because Ed had always been considered trustworthy. A neighbor testified that Ed avoided conversations about the disappearance, often leaving gatherings suddenly whenever the topic surfaced. Each testimony chipped away at the illusion of who Ed had pretended to be. The defense struggled. They tried to paint Ed as a helpful, hardworking man, someone who never showed cruelty, someone respected by all. They questioned the reliability of memories from decades earlier. They tried to sow doubt in the DNA mapping technique, but every argument they made crumbled when compared to the physical evidence. The axe handle, the tarp, the genetic link, the timeline. It all formed a chain that no amount of courtroom pleading could break. And as people watched Ed sit motionless at the defense table, expression stiff, eyes unblinking, a chilling understanding swept through the room. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a misidentification. This was the truth finally dragging itself into the light. The trial didn't just expose Ed Thorne. It exposed Ravenwood. Every hidden doubt, every unspoken fear, every old resentment surfaced the moment Ed's name became tied to Marissa's murder. What had once been a close, cooperative frontier town now stood divided in ways no one could have imagined. On one side were those who demanded justice with a ferocity that bordered on rage. These were the families who raised children along the same roads Marissa once walked, the parents who had looked over their shoulders for decades, the people who never forgot the terror that swept through Ravenwood in 1875. They sat in the courtroom with stiff jaws and clenched fists, refusing to let sympathy cloud their judgment. To them, Ed was exactly what the evidence proved, a man who had stolen a child's life and hidden behind a friendly smile. But on the other side, a smaller group clung to disbelief. These were the ones who had benefited most from Ed's generosity, the families whose homes he helped repair, the workers he employed when times were tough, the neighbors who remembered him loading wood for elderly residents during harsh winters. They convinced themselves the evidence was being misinterpreted, that the town was rushing to condemn an innocent man. Some whispered that authorities were too eager to close the cold case and were using Ed as an easy target. Those caught in the middle felt completely paralyzed. They didn't defend Ed, but they couldn't bring themselves to condemn him outright. Their faces carried nothing but pain and utter confusion. They remembered cookouts, barn raisings, church gatherings. They remembered Ed standing shoulder to shoulder with them through droughts and floods. And now they were being asked to believe he had committed the most unforgivable act imaginable. Old friendships dissolved overnight. People who had grown up together stopped speaking. Businesses suffered because customers refused to enter stores owned by anyone associated with Ed. Arguments broke out on porches, in saloons, outside the mill. Not about evidence, but about loyalty. Some demanded Ed's name be wiped from every record in town. Others insisted he was framed or misunderstood. Some stayed silent, too ashamed that they hadn't seen the truth for nearly 50 years. The divide sliced through Ravenwood like a blade. The trial wasn't just about finding justice for Marissa anymore. It was about forcing an entire community to confront how deeply it had failed her. It was about choosing between comfort and truth. And with every passing day in court, the town realized something they didn't want to admit. Ed Thorne didn't just harm one child, he damaged the soul of Ravenwood. For the Delaney family, the trial wasn't just a legal process. It was the reopening of a wound that had never healed. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every photo shown in court brought back memories they had spent years trying to manage without breaking. Eleanor Delaney, now older and far quieter than she once was, sat in the front row during every hearing. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if holding them together was the only thing preventing her entire body from collapsing under the weight of what she was hearing. Each time the prosecutor mentioned the axe handle or the tarp, her eyes closed, not in denial but in agony. Agony that came from finally realizing the man who comforted her after her daughter vanished had been the one responsible. She had spoken to Ed Thorne dozens of times over the decades. She had thanked him for his help after storms. She had accepted his condolences at community events. She had even leaned on him during the foundation events she started in Marissa's honor. That was the cruelest part. Her foundation, Marissa's Light, created to help other missing children, had been supported by Ed himself. He had donated lumber for their fundraisers. He had shown up at every annual memorial walk. He had shaken Eleanor's hand while knowing exactly where her daughter lay buried. The irony was enough to make people in the courtroom look away from her, because no one knew how to meet the eyes of a mother who had been comforted by her child's killer. Victor Delaney, once a strong and steady presence in the town, carried his bitterness differently. He didn't cry in public. He didn't speak often, but his silence was loud. He kept his gaze fixed on Ed during the trial, his jaw clenched, his breathing sharp. Every time a new piece of evidence was presented, Victor's shoulders tightened like he was bracing against another blow. He had blamed himself for years, for not searching harder, for not demanding more from Sheriff Hansen, for trusting the wrong people. Now, listening to the truth unfold, he realized the guilt he had carried belonged to someone else entirely. But that didn't lighten the pain. It deepened it, because the man he should have feared had stood at his side, offering support he never asked for. And Victor had accepted it, believing it came from kindness instead of cruelty. The Delaneys didn't just face the truth about Marissa's death. They faced the truth about how completely they had been deceived. And that truth nearly broke them. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom released a breath it had been holding for nearly 50 years. But Ed Thorne was not finished fighting. His attorneys immediately filed for appeals, arguing that the evidence was outdated, that memories were unreliable, that the genealogical process was too new, too complex, too dependent on numbers the average person couldn't understand. But the courts were no longer working with guesswork, fear, or rumor. They were working with hard, undeniable facts. The axe handle, its edges matched the shape of the skull fracture. Damage, weight, all consistent. No alternative explanation held up. The tarp, not a similar one, not a matching brand, the same tarp. The tear lines proved it. The fibers proved it. The unique pattern proved it. The DNA. The forensic team presented every step of their process. Amplification, cross-references, elimination of other relatives, confirmation through multiple independent labs. The defense tried to challenge the science, but the experts answered every question with clarity that could cut glass. The higher courts reviewed the evidence again and again. Each time, the conclusion was the same. The science held firm. The truth was unshakable. Ed Thorne was the man responsible. Some townspeople who had once defended him stopped attending the hearings. They couldn't argue with the facts anymore. Others still clung to denial, insisting the system had failed him, but their voices grew quieter with each appeal that collapsed. Eleanor attended every appeal hearing, sitting in the same seat, hands folded, eyes steady, not because she expected anything to change. She already knew justice was finally moving in the right direction, but because she refused to let Ed face the court alone. She wanted him to see her face every time the judges upheld the truth. She wanted him to feel the presence of the woman he had wronged more than anyone. Victor attended too, his silence as sharp as a blade. He didn't need to speak. His presence said enough. I waited half a lifetime for this. I'm not moving. One by one, every appeal failed, every challenge fell apart. Every attempt to overturn the verdict was denied. There was no loophole, no technical rescue, no hidden twist waiting to save him. For the first time since 1875, the truth stood taller than the lie that had held Ravenwood hostage for decades. Justice hadn't just arrived. It arrived with a force no one could stop. When the final appeal collapsed and Ed Thorne stood before the court with no escape left, a silence rolled through Ravenwood. Not the fearful silence that followed Marissa's disappearance, but a heavier, deeper one. It was the silence of people finally seeing the truth without distortion. The silence of a community confronting the cost of decades of blind trust. Ed didn't speak when the judge delivered the final ruling. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply stared forward, his expression hollow, as if he finally understood that the world he had fooled for nearly 50 years had turned its back on him forever. Outside the courthouse, the townspeople gathered in a crowd thicker than any the trial had seen. Some cried out of relief. Some cried out of anger. A few stood still, unable to process the collapse of a man they once respected. But for Eleanor and Victor Delaney, it wasn't relief. It wasn't closure. It wasn't victory. It was the first breath of truth after living half a life in the dark. The same thought moved through the town like a cold wind. It shouldn't have taken this long. It shouldn't have taken new technology. It shouldn't have taken another generation to expose what should have been seen in the beginning. But despite everything, the failures, the years of silence, the buried evidence, justice had finally risen. Late, painfully late, but unstoppable. Justice arrived late, but it arrived with a roar. When the truth about Ed Thorne finally settled across Ravenwood, the town felt something it had never felt before. A deep, searing kind of shame. It wasn't only grief for Marissa. It wasn't only anger at Ed. It was the crushing realization that the very thing they believed made their community strong had also made them blind. Ravenwood always took pride in knowing its people. They believed they could tell a good man from a dangerous one just by a handshake or a shared conversation. They believed kindness meant safety. They believed a familiar face was enough proof of a clean heart. But now they understood a truth far more painful than anything the courts revealed. Evil doesn't always hide in the dark. Sometimes it stands in the open, smiling, helping, earning trust it never deserved. People began replaying old memories in their minds. The times Ed brought firewood, the times he repaired fences, the times he comforted families during winter hardships. Every friendly gesture now felt poisoned. Every conversation felt like part of a mask he wore to keep suspicion far from him. Neighbors who once greeted each other warmly now studied every expression, every mention, every gesture with new caution. Not because they wanted to be suspicious, but because they finally understood how easily trust could be used as a weapon. And the hardest part? They realized they should have looked closer. They should have questioned more. They should have challenged the assumptions that kept them comfortable. Ravenwood didn't just learn the truth about a killer. It learned the truth about itself. In the years following the trial, Ravenwood realized something important. Marissa's life hadn't ended on that road in 1875. Her voice continued through every change the town made afterward. Eleanor Delaney's foundation, Marissa's Light, grew far beyond what anyone expected. At first, it was a small effort, just a few volunteers distributing flyers and helping families who feared their children might go missing. But after the truth about Ed Thorne surfaced, the foundation became a beacon for the entire state. People traveled from neighboring towns just to attend meetings, learn safety practices, and support families navigating the same nightmare. Marissa's name became a reminder that no child's disappearance should ever be dismissed, delayed, or doubted. Schools introduced new safety protocols. Sheriffs across the county revised their training, promising never to repeat Sheriff Hanson's mistakes. Search procedures became organized, detailed, and immediate. Community members were taught how to report suspicious behavior without fear of being ignored. Even the playground built years after her disappearance, a place once filled with joy, was redesigned with her memory in mind. A plaque bearing her name was placed at the entrance, not as a somber reminder of tragedy, but as a symbol of resilience and the determination to protect future generations. For viewers today, Marissa's story carries lessons that reach far beyond Ravenwood. Her legacy teaches us that danger rarely announces itself, that we must pay attention to the small signs, the things we overlook because they don't fit our assumptions, that every community, no matter how peaceful it appears, must remain alert. And most importantly, her story shows that silence never leads to safety. Only action does. As Ravenwood tried to rebuild, the town learned a truth that stretched far beyond the case itself, a truth every viewer needs to hear. For years, people had convinced themselves that danger always came from outsiders, from shadows, from strangers passing through. But Marissa's story shattered that belief completely. The lesson wasn't gentle, it wasn't comforting, but it was necessary. Evil doesn't always look like a threat at first glance. Sometimes it wears a familiar face. Sometimes it stands close enough to touch. Sometimes it earns trust long before revealing what it's capable of. That was the part of the story that stayed with people the longest, not the evidence, not the courtroom details, not even the arrest, but the idea that what goes unchallenged can grow into something devastating. Ravenwood learned this too late. By the time they realized the truth, the damage had already stretched across generations. The silence, the assumptions, the community's blind faith, all of it helped a dangerous man walk freely for nearly half a century. It's a reminder for every viewer watching right now. What we ignore today becomes tomorrow's tragedy. That line wasn't just meant for the people of Ravenwood. It's meant for anyone who believes their community is too safe, too kind, or too familiar for something like this to happen. It happened there. It can happen anywhere. After everything Ravenwood endured, the years of silence, the misplaced trust, the buried truth, one message rose above all the pain. You cannot afford to be unprepared. For nearly 50 years, the people of this town believed they were safe because nothing bad had happened recently. They believed kindness protected them. They believed familiarity was enough to keep danger away. They were wrong, terribly wrong. And that mistake didn't just cost them peace, it cost them Marissa. So as you sit here listening to this story, ask yourself something honest. Are you paying attention to the world around you? Or are you assuming you're safe because danger hasn't reached your doorstep yet? Because Ravenwood made that assumption, and it nearly destroyed them. This story isn't just a warning. It's a reminder that the next threat is rarely the one you expect. Which brings us here to you. Don't wait to learn danger too late. Subscribe and stay ahead of darkness. And if you hear this and still refuse to subscribe, then do something for me. If you still won't, tell us in the comments. What's stopping you? Your silence is its own kind of risk. When the dust finally settled over Ravenwood, People didn't talk about Ed Thorne as much as they talked about the little girl whose laughter once echoed through their streets. Marissa became more than a memory. She became a reminder of how quickly the light in a community can be taken and how far the truth can be buried when no one is willing to question what feels comfortable. Even years later, as new families moved in and old wounds slowly faded, the town kept one tradition alive. Every autumn, on the week she disappeared, a single lantern was placed along the road where her bicycle was found. No speeches, no ceremonies, just a quiet light for a child who never made it home. A soft signal to anyone passing by. Some stories never leave you, especially the ones that should have ended differently.